Cadillac just walked into Formula One and made Aston Martin look uncomfortable. That is the shock Melbourne handed us before this season could even settle. One team came in as a brand new project with low expectations, limited time, and every reason to struggle. The other arrived with Newey, Honda power, Fernando Alonso, and years of money behind it, yet the team under real pressure was not the startup. It was Aston Martin. Right now, that is one of the strangest and most important stories on the grid, because this was supposed to be the season where Aston Martin finally looked complete. Instead, the first signs out of Melbourne pointed in the other direction. Alonso could only qualify 17th. Lance Stroll did not even set a time, and both Aston Martins ended the race early while the team focused on protecting parts and learning what the car could still handle. Cadillac was nowhere near the front, but Sergio Perez still got one car to the finish, and that matters more than people want to admit. What no broadcast covered is this. One team arrived knowing exactly what success looked like, and the other arrived still trying to understand its own car. That is why this story feels bigger than one weekend. Cadillac did not show up to shock the grid with raw pace. It showed up looking organized, realistic, and ready to build. Aston Martin showed up with far more talent, far more hype, and far more pressure. But the opening picture was messy, fragile, and full of questions. And when a new team looks more settled than a super project built for this exact rule change, something has already gone wrong somewhere. To see how that happened, you have to start with the team that did the hardest job first. Cadillac did not arrive in Formula One trying to fake greatness. They arrived trying to prove they belonged. That is why their first real win had nothing to do with points or headlines. It was the simple fact that this team came from almost nothing, built the structure, built the car, got both machines through qualifying, and got one of them to the flag in Melbourne. For a startup operation, that is not a small detail. That is the entire foundation. While other teams were judged against podium dreams, Cadillac was judged against reality, and in that fight, they were already ahead. The scale of that job is what makes this story serious. Cadillac only got final approval to join the grid in March 2025, which left the team on an aggressive clock before the 2026 opener. Ferrari agreed to supply the power unit and gearbox for this phase, giving Cadillac something stable to build around while General Motors works toward its own engine project later in the decade. Graham Loudon and the leadership group had to build a full racing operation across multiple sites, hire at speed, and still arrive with a car ready for a race weekend. Sergio Perez then qualified ahead of Valtteri Bottas and finished the Grand Prix, which gave the project something even more valuable than pace: proof. That is where the pressure starts to shift. Cadillac came into Melbourne needing credibility, and it left with exactly that. Nobody expected this team to scare the front runners yet, but getting through the first test of a season without falling apart changes how the paddock sees you. It says the base is real. It says the plan is working. And once a new team clears that first brutal hurdle, the next question is no longer whether it belongs here. The next question is why a far richer team looked less prepared when the weekend actually began. Melbourne exposed the difference between being slow and being unstable. Cadillac was clearly off the pace, but the team still looked functional when the weekend got serious. Sergio Perez put the car 18th on the grid with a best lap of 1 minute 22.605. Valtteri Bottas followed in 19th with 1 minute 23.244. And both cars at least completed the basic job a new team had to complete in its first qualifying session. Aston Martin told a different story. Fernando Alonso only managed 17th. Lance Stroll never set a qualifying time. And suddenly, the pressure was no longer about speed alone. It was about whether the whole operation was actually ready. Race day made that contrast even sharper. Perez brought the Cadillac home in 16th, 3 laps down, which sounds rough until you remember what this weekend was really asking from that team. Bottas retired early with a fuel system problem, but Cadillac still left Melbourne with one finisher and real mileage in the bank. Aston Martin could not say the same. Alonso retired after the team used the race to gather information, while Stroll was left unclassified after his troubled weekend never truly recovered. What no broadcast covered is this: Cadillac's result was not impressive because of where it finished. It mattered because the team handled its first real F1 hit and stayed standing. That is why this weekend changed the tone of the whole story. Cadillac left Australia still looking limited but honest about what it is. Aston Martin left with a much more dangerous problem because the car showed flashes of potential while the full package around it still looked fragile. One team now has a clear next step: find pace. The other has a harder job, because before Aston can chase performance, it first has to understand why this project already feels so delicate under pressure. Aston Martin did not arrive in Melbourne with just one problem. They arrived with problems that kept feeding each other. That is what made this weekend feel so uneasy. Fernando Alonso was already talking about progress instead of performance, which told you the team knew this car was not ready to show its full hand yet. Lance Stroll then missed running with an icy issue and never even got a qualifying lap on the board, while Alonso was left down in 17th trying to squeeze something out of a package that still looked incomplete. But here is what the paddock is not talking about. This was never just about one bad session or one weak lap. It was the whole chain underneath the surface. The warning signs were there before the race weekend even began. Aston's own Bahrain testing was hit by battery-related issues, with the team ending the final day with only 6 laps on the board. And Formula One's own reporting described a shortage of power unit parts, while Honda investigated the problem back in Japan. That left Aston chasing reliability before it could even think properly about pace. Adrian Newey also made it clear earlier in the year that the AMR26 came together under a very compressed build window, with the first proper shakedown only arriving at Barcelona after an intense winter push. Nobody in that garage expected what came next, because once the season opened, Aston was still learning the car, while others were already trying to race it. That is why Aston Martin now feels so dangerous to judge too early and too worrying to trust too easily. The car may still have upside. Alonso himself said the potential is huge, but potential means very little when the full package cannot stay settled through a race weekend. Cadillac's challenge was always pace. Aston's challenge is harder, because it has to fix the weak links, protect the car, and still prove that all this ambition was building towards something real. And that takes this story straight to the man who changed the scale of Aston Martin's dreams, Adrian Newey. Adrian Newey was supposed to be the name that made Aston Martin feel inevitable. Instead, his arrival has made this project harder to judge and even harder to trust. That is the paradox sitting over this team right now. The AMR26 is the first Aston Martin shaped by Newey's design thinking, the first real look at what this new era is trying to become. And that alone is enough to make every fan lean in. But belief only carries you so far when the first race weekend ends with more questions than answers. The man who raised Aston Martin's ceiling may also be the reason this car needs more time than anyone wanted to admit. What makes this story so tense is that Newey never sold this car as a finished masterpiece from day one. Aston Martin's own coverage pushed the idea that fans should keep an open mind about where the AMR26 starts and where it could end. While Newey spoke about a busy 10-month build and a car shaped around long-term development potential, that tells you everything. This was not a simple win-now machine built to dominate the opener. It was a concept with ambition, risk, and a lot of work still hiding underneath the bodywork. And when Fernando Alonso is the driver being asked to carry that kind of project through its rough early phase, the pressure gets very real, very fast. That is why Newey changes this story without solving it. He gives Aston Martin a future that still feels dangerous enough to scare rivals. But he also makes every weekend feel bigger because nobody sees him as a builder of average cars. If the AMR26 grows into what Aston believes it can become, this opening pain will be remembered as the cost of building something special. If it does not, then all the hype around this project turns into a weight the team cannot hide from. And that opens the door to the next part of the story, because while Aston is wrestling with complexity, another giant force is quietly shaping both sides of this fight: Ferrari. Ferrari is not the headline of this battle, but Ferrari is all over it. That is what makes this part so important. While Aston Martin is trying to unlock a bold new idea with Honda, Cadillac has taken the opposite route and built its first season around something proven: Ferrari power, Ferrari gearbox, fewer moving parts, fewer unknowns. That decision did not turn Cadillac into a threat at the front, but it did give the team something every new project needs before anything else: stability. And when a brand new operation looks calmer than a giant rebuild backed by one of the biggest names in the sport, the choice of foundation suddenly looks very smart. At the same time, Ferrari's own works team showed why that base still matters. Charles Leclerc put the SF26 near the sharp end in Melbourne. Lewis Hamilton also reached Q3, and even though Mercedes had the stronger weekend overall, Ferrari still looked like a car with real race season weight. That matters here because it sharpens the contrast. Cadillac borrowed from a system that already knows how to function under pressure. Aston Martin chose the harder path, a fresh Honda era, a Newey-led concept, and a package still trying to become one complete machine. The data tells a completely different story when you look past the badge. One team chose manageable complexity. The other chose maximum ambition. That is why Ferrari sits in the background of this whole drama like a silent force. It gives Cadillac a clean way into Formula One while reminding Aston Martin how unforgiving this sport becomes when your package is not fully connected. One project is using borrowed strength to build confidence. The other is trying to create its own identity under extreme pressure. And once you see that split clearly, the next question is no longer about hardware alone. It becomes about expectations and about which team was always going to be judged by a completely different standard. Cadillac and Aston Martin did not enter Melbourne carrying the same weight, and that is why the reaction to this weekend landed so differently. Cadillac only needed to look real. It only needed to show that this project belonged on the grid, that the structure was in place, that the first step had been taken without chaos. Aston Martin walked in under a completely different light. This team had years of investment behind it, a massive reset built around Adrian Newey and Honda, and Fernando Alonso leading the charge. So when Cadillac simply looked orderly, that felt like progress. When Aston Martin looked unfinished, that felt like a warning. That gap in expectation changed everything about how Melbourne was judged. Graham Loudon and Cadillac's leadership have framed this entire build as the start of a long climb, while Aston Martin's own public message has carried the tone of a team trying to open a new era. Those are not the same targets, and they do not create the same pressure inside a garage. Cadillac could leave Australia with one classified finisher and still feel that the base was alive. Aston could point to hidden potential and still leave people uneasy, because a project with Alonso, Newey, Honda, and a state-of-the-art campus is not supposed to feel this fragile at the first serious test. That is what makes the final verdict of this story so sharp. Cadillac did not need speed to win this phase. It needed trust, and Melbourne gave it that. Aston Martin did not lose because of one result alone. It lost control of the narrative because the project now feels less settled than the team that was built from zero. One operation leaves Australia with patience on its side. The other leaves with urgency already building around it. And that takes this story to its hardest conclusion of all, because now it is time to decide which team really won the first credibility fight of the season. Cadillac won the first fight that actually mattered. Not the speed fight, not the points fight, not the glamour fight, the credibility fight. That is the part many people miss when they judge a season opener only by the finishing order. This team arrived with a brand new structure, a borrowed Ferrari base, two experienced drivers in Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas, and a clear understanding of what success looked like in race 1. Get on the grid. Run properly. Learn fast. Finish if possible. That may sound basic, but for a new constructor, it is everything. In Melbourne, Cadillac looked like a team beginning its climb with its feet under it. Aston Martin leaves that same weekend carrying a much heavier truth. The AMR 26 may still have pace hidden inside it. Adrian Newey may still shape this into something far stronger later in the season. Fernando Alonso may yet drag big results out of a package that clearly has more in it than Melbourne allowed it to show. But none of that changes the first impression. This was supposed to be the opening chapter of a serious new era, and instead, it felt like a project still trying to connect all its parts under pressure. In a season where Mercedes has already landed hard and Ferrari still looks dangerous, that kind of slow start can become expensive very quickly. So that is the real outcome of Melbourne. Cadillac did not leave as a threat, but it did leave with respect, and respect is the first thing a new team has to earn before anything bigger can follow. Aston Martin did not leave beaten forever, but it did leave exposed, because now every race will be watched through the lens of what this project promised to become. One team walked away looking grounded. The other walked away looking unfinished. And that is why the first big surprise of 2026 was not who was fastest, but who looked most ready to belong.